The sun rose over West Texas the way a fever breaks, not with gentle warmth, but with a pale, searing intensity that promised another day of torment. It was a land bleached of mercy, a vast and silent expanse of cracked caliche earth that stretched to a horizon shimmering with heat. Here, life clung on by a thread. Gnarled mesquite trees, their branches twisted like arthritic fingers, offered little shade, and the prickly pear cactus stood in spiny, defiant clumps. The sky was an immense, empty bowl of faded blue, indifferent to the struggles that played out beneath it. Isolation was the air you breathed. The nearest neighbor, if you could call a man you saw twice a year a neighbor, was a half-day's ride to the south, the town of redemption, with its saloon, its general store, and its dust-choked Main Street, was a full day's journey to the east, a journey one did not make lightly. The landscape itself was an enemy, a patient and ever-present threat. It could kill you with thirst one month and drown you in a flash flood the next. Its silence was broken by the dry rattle of a diamondback in the shade of a rock or the lonely cry of a hawk circling on the high, hot currents of the air. This was the world of Ilara Hayes, and it was the only world she had ever known. Her day began before the first hint of light, in the cool, pre-dawn gray. At 19, Ilara moved with the quiet efficiency of a woman 3 times her age. The bright spark of youth had long been banked in her eyes, leaving behind a weary, watchful glow. Her hands, crisscrossed with calluses from the axe handle and the water yoke, were deft but never soft. The sun had weathered her skin to the color of buckskin and drawn fine lines at the corners of her eyes. She was built for endurance, a spare and sinewy frame that knew nothing of rest. The cabin was 2 small rooms of sod and scavenged timber, dug partially into the earth for protection against the punishing heat of summer and the bitter winds of winter. The inside was sparse, stripped to the bare necessities of survival, but it was clean. The packed dirt floor was swept, the few tin plates were scrubbed, and the single blanket on her narrow cot was neatly folded. But the small space was dominated by the one piece of real furniture they owned, the heavy wooden bed where her mother, Martha, lay dying. The sickness had a name whispered in town with a mixture of fear and pity: consumption. To Ilara, it had a sound. It was the dry, rattling cough that began deep in her mother's chest and seemed to shake the very foundations of their small home. It was a hollow percussion, the sound of dry leaves skittering across stone, and it was the soundtrack to Ilara's life. She moved to the bedside, her bare feet silent on the cool earth. Martha's breathing was a shallow whisper of air. Ilara lit the small cook stove, her movements practiced and economical, and set a pot of water to boil. The steam, her mother had once said in a moment of clarity, helped to loosen the tightness in her chest. Ilara would hold the pot near the bed, letting the warm vapor rise into her mother's face, a meager comfort against an relentless disease. She dipped a clean rag into a basin of cool water and gently wiped the sweat from her mother's brow. Martha's skin was nearly translucent, her cheekbones sharp angles beneath the flesh. Her eyes fluttered open, the blue within them clouded by fever. "Ilara," she breathed, the word a fragile wisp of sound. "I am here, Mama." Ilara's voice was low and steady, a constant anchor in her mother's drifting consciousness. She tried to coax a few spoonfuls of thin rabbit broth into her mother, a broth she had sat up half the night preparing. Martha managed 2 swallows before a spasm seized her, and the dry, hacking cough returned, leaving her breathless and exhausted. In those moments, when the haze of fever cleared, Ilara could see the raw despair in her mother's eyes, the terrible clarity of a woman who knew she had become a crushing burden on the only person she had left in the world. They spoke little. There was no need for words to express the love that bound them, or the grief that was slowly, inexorably pulling them apart. Their conversations were in the touch of a hand, the offering of a cup of water, and the long, heavy silences filled with everything that could not be said. Inside the quiet walls of the cabin, Alara felt the weight of her love as a physical thing, a heavy stone in her chest. But when she stepped outside, into the vast, unforgiving emptiness of the land, another feeling rose to swallow it, a loneliness so profound it felt like a kind of starvation. The central ritual of her day, the task around which all others revolved, was fetching water. Their own well, dug by her father's sweat and toil, had gone dry the summer before. Another casual cruelty of the land. The only reliable source now was a creek 2 miles to the west, a winding ribbon of life that cut through the parched landscape. After settling her mother, Alara would lift the heavy wooden yoke onto her shoulders. It was a cruel device, designed to distribute the weight of the 2 buckets, but by the end of the journey, it felt as though it were trying to press her into the very earth. The path was worn into the ground by her own feet, a faint trail snaking through the mesquite and creosote bush. Every step was a calculation of risk. She watched the ground for the telltale coil of a rattlesnake, her ears tuned for its deadly warning. She watched the sky for the dark bruises of a storm that could gather in the distant hills and send a wall of water roaring down the dry creek bed without a moment's notice. And she watched the horizon for another threat. The one from the stories her father used to tell in a low voice by the firelight, stories of Comanche raids, of violence that could sweep out of the silent land and disappear just as quickly, leaving only devastation behind. The stories were old, from a time before she was born, but in this place, the past was never very far away. It was on one of these trips, with the sun climbing toward its zenith and beating down on her neck, that she felt it for the first time. A prickling sensation on her skin, the kind of animal instinct that signals you are no longer alone. She stopped, her body stock still, the yoke digging into her shoulders. The silence of the plains pressed in on her. She slowly scanned the rocky outcrops that jutted from the earth like broken teeth, and the thin, sparse line of cottonwood trees that marked the course of the creek ahead. She saw nothing. A lone hawk circled high above, a black speck against the searing blue. The wind whispered through the dry grass. "It is nothing," she told herself. "It is the heat, the loneliness. It is your own mind playing tricks on you." She forced her feet to move, continuing toward the creek, but the feeling lingered. A cold spot in the center of her back. It was there as she knelt by the slow-moving water. The clear stream a miracle in this thirsty world. It was there as she dipped the buckets, the sound of the wood knocking against the rocks unnaturally loud. And it was there, stronger than ever, on the long walk back. She did not run. The water was too precious to spill, but her pace quickened, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The sloshing of the water in the buckets seemed to shout her presence to the empty land, a clumsy, vulnerable sound in the immense. Listening silence. The next day, it returned. The feeling was immediate, undeniable. As soon as she left the relative safety of the cabin, a knot of dread tightened in her stomach, but she pushed it down. Her mother needed water. There was no choice. She walked with a grim determination, her eyes constantly scanning, her senses stretched taut. She reached the creek and knelt, her back to the open expanse. She worked quickly, dipping the first bucket and setting it carefully on the bank, as she plunged the second one into the cool, clear stream. A flicker of movement on the opposite bank snagged her attention. It was no more than a shift of shadow, but it was enough. She froze, the bucket half submerged in her hands. Her head lifted slowly, her heart stopped. Standing there, partially concealed by the twisted ancient trunk of a gnarled juniper tree, was a man. His skin was the color of the red earth, his black hair long and unbound. He wore buckskin leggings and a simple breechcloth. In one hand, he held a bow, held loosely, its tip resting on the ground. He was Comanche. The realization hit her not as a thought, but as a jolt of pure, ice-cold terror. Every horror story, every whispered warning, Every half-forgotten tale of violence and bloodshed her father had ever told her flooded her mind in a single, paralyzing wave. She could not breathe. She could not move. She could only stare, her eyes wide with a terror so absolute it felt like death itself. He did not move. He made no sound. He simply stood there, watching her. His stillness was the most terrifying thing of all. There was no war cry, no brandished weapon, no sign of aggression. It was an act of quiet, intense observation. But through the thick filter of her fear, she could see it only as the patient gaze of a predator. A strangled gasp escaped her lips. Breaking the spell of her paralysis, she scrambled to her feet, abandoning the half-filled bucket in the creek. It tipped over, its precious water bleeding back into the stream. She fumbled with the yoke, getting only one bucket handle properly seated before she turned and fled. She half ran, half stumbled back along the path, the yoke thrown off balance, the single heavy bucket banging painfully against her leg, sloshing water onto the thirsty ground with every clumsy step. She did not dare to look back. She was certain that at any moment she would feel the sharp, piercing sting of an arrow in her back. The blood pounded in her ears, a roaring that drowned out the sound of her own ragged breaths. She burst through the door of the cabin, slamming it shut and dropping the heavy wooden bar into place. Her chest heaved, her lungs burning. She leaned against the rough-hewn planks, her body trembling uncontrollably. After a long moment, she crept to a small crack in the sod wall, a peephole she had used since childhood to watch for her father's return from a hunt. Her eye pressed to the narrow opening. She scanned the path leading from the creek. It was empty. He was not there. He had not followed her. The relief was so immense it made her dizzy, her knees weak. But as the first wave of terror subsided, it was replaced by a new and colder kind of dread. He was out there, somewhere in the vast, silent landscape. He was out there, and she would have to go back for water tomorrow. That night was an agony of sleeplessness. She did not even try to lie down, every creak of the timber roof settling, every gust of wind moaning around the corners of the cabin, sounded like the footstep of an intruder. She sat in a hard-backed chair near her mother's bed, her father's old, heavy shotgun resting across her lap. Its weight was a small, cold comfort. She watched the pale shape of her mother sleeping fitfully, and she listened to the sounds of the night, her fear a tight, cold knot in the pit of her stomach. But beneath the fear, a tiny, unwelcome seed of a question had been planted. It was a thought that she tried to push away, but it kept returning, persistent and troubling. Why had he done nothing? Why did he just watch? The days that followed fell into a new and terrifying routine. Her fear did not lessen, but it changed, sharpening into a kind of high-strung, nervous vigilance. Every time she made the journey to the creek, he was there. He was always on the opposite bank, never closer, never farther away. He would appear as she arrived, a silent figure materializing from the landscape as if he were born of the rock and scrub himself. And he would remain, a statue carved from brown stone, until she had filled her buckets and begun the long, tense walk home. Her initial, blinding terror began to slowly, almost imperceptibly, evolve. It was impossible to remain in a state of pure panic day after day. Her mind, in a desperate attempt to make sense of the threat, began to notice things. He was young, not much older than she was. His face, from what she could discern across the water, was thin, almost gaunt, etched with a severity that looked more like hardship than cruelty. There was a deep sadness in the way he stood, a stillness that was not just patience, but a kind of profound weariness. He was not the bloodthirsty, painted savage from the stories. He was just a man, alone in the wilderness. He was just a man, alone, like her. The thought was disloyal, a betrayal of her fear. She began to carry the heavy shotgun with her on her trips to the creek. The weight was a cumbersome burden on top of the yoke, and it made the journey even more grueling. But she never raised it. She never even looked as if she might. A silent, tense standoff became the new normal of her life. She would kneel by the water, her back to the open country, but her senses screamingly aware of the silent man watching her from across the creek. And he would watch, his expression unreadable, his purpose a terrifying, unanswered question that hung in the oppressive Texas heat. The days bled into weeks, and the sun continued its relentless march across the Texas sky. The silent presence of the Comanche man became a fixture in Ilara's life, as regular and as unchangeable as the sunrise. Her terror, a wild and panicked thing at first, had burned itself out, leaving behind the cool ashes of a tense and wary acceptance. The daily journey to the creek was no longer a flight from a nameless horror, but a cautious pilgrimage to a known and constant mystery. In the private world of her own thoughts, she had given him a name, the Watcher. It seemed to fit the silent, unblinking nature of his vigil. Her observations of him, once frantic and unfocused, sharpened into a quiet study. She noticed the way he moved, a fluid economy of motion that wasted no effort. When he shifted his weight, it was a single, silent act. He was a part of the landscape, as natural as the hawk that rode the thermals above. His moccasins were worn, the hide softened and frayed by countless miles of hard country. His buckskin leggings and breechcloth were bare of any ornament. No beads, no painted symbols, no feathers. It was the stark attire of a man with no tribe, or one in deep mourning. The thought was a surprise to her, a crack in the monolithic image of the savage warrior. He always carried his bow, and she saw now the long knife sheathed at his belt, its hilt of worn bone. Yet his posture never spoke of attack. It was one of stillness, of waiting. He simply watched her perform her grueling, repetitive task, his face a mask of neutrality from across the slow-moving water, his expression as unreadable as the stone outcrops behind him. This strange, silent relationship, a delicate tension held in the vast emptiness, was shattered one afternoon by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. It was a sound so alien in her quiet world that she froze, a half-peeled potato in her hand. Her mother was sleeping, her breathing a faint rasp in the stillness of the cabin. Ilara moved to the door, peering through the crack. A lone rider was making his way up the path, a big man on a big horse, his presence seeming to shrink the already small homestead. It was Silas Croft. He was a local rancher whose land bordered theirs miles to the east. A man in his late 30s with a thick neck and a face reddened by sun and whiskey. He was physically imposing and carried himself with the swagger of a man who believed his size and his modest wealth entitled him to whatever he wanted. He dismounted, tying his horse to the hitching post her father had erected a decade ago. On the back of his saddle were a heavy sack of flour and a slab of salted pork wrapped in butcher's paper. Ilara opened the door before he could knock, her expression carefully neutral. She would show no fear. "Afternoon, Ilara," he boomed, his voice too loud for the small space. He smiled, but it didn't reach his hard, pale eyes. "Was in the area. Thought I'd check on you and your mother. Brought you a few supplies." "That is kind of you, Mr. Croft," she said, her voice quiet. "We manage." "Nonsense," he said, brushing past her and setting the provisions on her small table. His presence immediately filled the cabin, sucking the air out of it. He smelled of sweat, leather, and the sour tang of the saloon. His eyes roved over the sparse interior before settling on her, a slow, appraising look that made her feel as though she were a piece of livestock he was considering for purchase. She felt a sudden, desperate urge to cover herself, though her dress was plain and high-necked. "How is Martha holding up?" he asked, his attempt at sympathy sounding hollow and rehearsed. "She has good days and bad," Ilara answered, moving to put the flour in the bin, needing to put some distance between them. He began to talk, filling the quiet of her home with the noise of the outside world. He spoke of cattle prices, of a dispute over a fence line, of gossip from the town of Redemption. And then, his voice took on a harder edge. He started talking about the Comanche, Gave a few of them a proper lesson last month, he said, leaning against the doorframe, blocking her only exit. His tone was casual, but his eyes held a cruel glint. A small band thought they could run off some of my stock. We tracked them for 2 days, taught them that this ain't their land no more. He described the hunt with a sickening relish, the violence of it laid bare in his boastful words. Ilara felt a cold lump of disgust and fear form in her throat. She said nothing, just continued to move about the small kitchen, her back to him, her hands busy with chores that didn't need doing. His monologue was a poison, seeping into the clean, quiet air of her home. "It is a problem," he continued, his voice dripping with venom. "This whole territory is infested. A man has to be hard to survive out here. A woman alone." He let the sentence hang in the air, his meaning unmistakable. He took a step closer to her. "A woman like you, Ilara, with a sick mother. You need a man's protection. You need looking after." His implication was as clear and as predatory as a circling hawk. His presence felt like a violation, an invasion far more personal and threatening than the silent man who watched her from 100 feet away across a creek. The watcher had never crossed the water. Silas Croft had crossed the threshold of her home and brought all the ugliness of the world in with him. She finally turned to face him, her spine straight, her hands clenched at her sides. "My mother and I are grateful for the supplies, Mr. Croft, but we are fine." His eyes narrowed slightly, unused to being rebuffed. He gave a short, humorless laugh. "Stubborn, just like your father. Well, you know where I am if you come to your senses." He tipped his hat, his eyes lingering on her one last time before he turned and left. Ilara stood frozen until the sound of his horse's hoofbeats faded into the immense silence. Only then did she let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She walked to the open door and stared out at the empty land. The quiet that descended felt like a blessing, a clean sheet of air after the foulness of his visit. But it was a different quiet now. It was the quiet of vulnerability. For the first time, she felt the stark contrast between the two men who occupied the edges of her world. Silas Croft, a white man, one of her own kind, was the one who made her feel soiled and unsafe. And the watcher, the Comanche, the savage, was the one whose presence was quiet, unobtrusive, and distant. She found herself thinking of him now, not with fear, but with a strange and complex curiosity. The next day, she made her way to the creek, her mind still churning with the memory of Silas's visit. The weight of his words, the possessive look in his eyes, had left a greasy film on her spirit. She was so lost in thought, so preoccupied with this new, tangible threat, that she did not watch the path as carefully as she usually did. She was nearly upon it when she saw it, coiled in the middle of the dusty trail. A pattern of brown diamonds almost invisible against the earth was a large western diamondback. She froze mid-stride, her breath catching in her throat. The snake's head lifted, its black tongue flicking out to taste the air. Then came the sound, a dry, buzzing hum that vibrated through the soles of her worn boots. A sound that meant death. The rattle filled the air, a dry, deadly proclamation in the otherwise silent landscape. Her mind went blank with terror. She knew any sudden movement would provoke a strike. She was too close to run, too far to retreat. She could only stand, a statue of fear, and wait for the inevitable, fiery pain. Before she could even scream, the silent thwack of an arrow cut through the air. It was a sound so soft it was almost lost in the snake's rattling. The arrow struck the diamondback's head with impossible precision. Pinning it to the ground, the rattling stopped instantly. The coiled body convulsed once, then lay still. From a thicket of mesquite not 20 feet away, the watcher stepped into the open. His bow was still slightly raised, a second arrow ready on the string. This was the closest he had ever been. She could see his face clearly now. He was young, his features sharp and angular, his dark eyes intense. They were not the eyes of a savage, but of a man who had seen too much sorrow. Their eyes met, and for a long, charged moment. The world seemed to hold its breath. He looked from her face to the dead snake at her feet, and then back to her. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Then, as silently as he had appeared, he turned and melted back into the brush. He did not speak. He did not approach her. It was a clear, unambiguous act of protection. Ilara stood trembling, her gaze fixed on the arrow quivering in the snake's head. He could have let it bite her. He could have used her moment of complete vulnerability to attack her. He had done the opposite. He had saved her life. That night, she could not stop replaying the moment in her head. The swift, silent flight of the arrow, the intensity in his eyes, the small, acknowledging nod. The fear she had carried for weeks was gone, shattered and replaced by a profound and unsettling gratitude. Her world had always been divided into two clear categories, the safety of her own people and the danger of the other. But Silas Croft had shown her the ugliness that could hide behind a familiar face, and the Watcher had shown her the honor that could exist in a stranger. The foundation of her understanding of the world had cracked. Everything she had ever been taught, every prejudice she had unknowingly absorbed, was now called into question. The next morning, when she prepared to leave for the creek, she did something new. She took a piece of the cornbread she had baked the day before, still warm from the stove, and wrapped it carefully in a clean scrap of cloth. Her heart pounded with a mixture of fear and a strange, exhilarating hope. What she was doing felt dangerous, a transgression against an unwritten law, but she had to do it. After she filled her buckets at the creek, she walked to the spot where he had appeared. She placed the small, cloth-wrapped bundle on a large, flat rock, a clear and deliberate offering, an acknowledgement, a thank you. She did not linger. She picked up her yoke and walked back to the cabin, the heavy buckets feeling lighter than they ever had before. From the crack in her wall, she watched the flat rock. For a long time, there was nothing but the heat shimmering over the land. She was beginning to think he would not come, that she had made a terrible mistake. Then, she saw him. He emerged from the cottonwoods, moving with his characteristic grace. He approached the rock cautiously, his eyes scanning the area. He paused, looked at the small bundle, then looked toward her cabin. She felt as if his gaze could pierce the very walls and see her there, watching. He picked up the cornbread, and without opening it, retreated back into the shadows of the trees. A silent communication had been established. A silent, fragile bridge was being built across a chasm of culture, language, and prejudice. The tentative exchange continued. Some days she would leave a piece of jerky from a rabbit he did not know he had helped her catch by providing her with the courage to set her snares farther from home. Another day, it was a baked potato, blackened from the coals of her fire. He never appeared to take it while she was there, but it was always gone when she returned the next day. A silent language was forming between them, a language of gesture and offering, of trust built in the vast, empty spaces. But while this fragile connection was growing in the outside world, inside the cabin, life was unraveling. Martha had a severe decline. The disease, which had been consuming her slowly for years, began to devour her. Her breathing became a shallow, ragged struggle for every gasp of air. The coughing fits that racked her thin body were deeper now, more painful, and when they subsided, the rag Ilara used to wipe her mother's mouth came away stained with bright, terrifying spots of blood. Ilara knew, with the cold certainty of grief, that the end was near. The town doctor was an impossible luxury, a full day's ride away, and his fee was more than she had seen in a year. Besides, she knew in her heart that there was nothing he could do. There was no medicine for this. There was only waiting. Her desperation became a palpable thing, a constant, frantic prayer for a miracle she knew would not come. One afternoon, the weight of it all became too much to bear. Her mother had finally fallen into an exhausted, feverish sleep. The silence in the cabin was thick with the smell of sickness and the specter of impending death. Alara felt as if the walls were closing in, suffocating her. She fled, stumbling out into the blinding sunlight. She ran, not even knowing where she was going, until her lungs burned and her feet found the familiar path to the creek. It was the only place she could be truly alone with the sorrow that was hollowing her out from the inside. She collapsed by the water's edge, the harsh reality of her life crashing down on her. And there, in the only sanctuary she had, she finally allowed herself to break. Her body was racked with silent, gut-wrenching sobs. Tears streamed down her face, falling onto the dry, thirsty ground. She did not make a sound, her grief too deep for noise. She wept for her dying mother, for the slow, agonizing loss of the only person she had in the world. She wept for her father, buried on the hill behind the cabin, who had left them alone in this unforgiving land. And she wept for herself, for her own lonely, impossible life, a life that felt like a cage from which there was no escape. Across the creek, hidden in his usual spot among the junipers, Tawo watched. He saw her collapse. He saw her shoulders shake with a grief so profound it needed no sound. And in that moment, he saw not a white woman, an alien presence in his world. He saw a person consumed by a sorrow that was achingly, horribly familiar. It was a grief that mirrored his own devastating losses, a pain that transcended the color of their skin or the language they spoke. He did not approach, he did not move. But his silent vigil was no longer one of mere observation. It was one of shared, empathetic witness. The morning after her collapse, Alara awoke feeling hollowed out, as if the storm of her grief had scoured her clean. The air in the cabin was stale and heavy with the scent of sickness. She moved through her morning chores in a daze, her body a machine performing tasks her mind barely registered. When it was time to fetch the water, she picked up the yoke in the buckets with a sense of numb inevitability. The world felt muted, its colors leached by her sorrow. As she approached the creek, her eyes fell upon the flat rock where she left her small offerings. Her daily piece of bread was gone, as usual, but in its place sat something else, a small, neat bundle of leaves and roots, carefully bound together with a thin, pale strip of yucca fiber. She stopped, her heart giving a painful lurch. She set down her buckets and walked slowly toward the rock, her bare feet hesitant on the sun-warmed earth. She knelt and picked up the offering. It was cool to the touch. She recognized the papery, gray-green bark of the willow tree. Her mother had sometimes made a bitter tea from it to fight a fever, a piece of old country wisdom. But the other plants were foreign to her, a thick, gnarled root that smelled of damp earth, and some dark, waxy leaves she had never seen before. She looked across the creek to the place where he always stood. He was not there. The juniper tree stood stark and empty against the morning sky. The absence of his familiar, watchful presence was more intimate than his nearness had ever been. This was not an exchange. This was a gift. It was a clear and silent response to the raw, voiceless despair he had witnessed the day before. It was a piece of his world, a fragment of his knowledge, offered to soothe her pain. She held the bundle in her trembling hands, her mind a battlefield. A lifetime of ingrained warnings and prejudices rose up within her. Using Indian medicine was a dark and forbidden thing. She could almost hear the voice of the preacher from Redemption on one of his rare visits, thundering from a makeshift pulpit about the evils of heathenism and the dark arts of the savages. To use these herbs would be to cross a line, to step away from her own world and into his. But then, another image rose to replace the preacher's angry face, the sight of her mother, frail and gasping, the bright, terrible specks of blood on the linen rag. The town doctor was a fantasy. Her own meager knowledge was useless. She was standing at the edge of a cliff, and her mother was slipping from her grasp. This bundle of roots and leaves, this taboo offering from a silent stranger, was the only hand reaching out to her. Her desperation, a force more powerful than any sermon, overrode her fear. Clutching the bundle tightly, She filled her buckets and returned to the cabin. Her hands shook as she worked, carefully separating the plants. She crushed the willow bark and the strange root between two stones, as she had seen her mother do with other herbs. She set a small pot of water to boil and dropped the mixture in. A strange, earthy smell, wild and unfamiliar, filled the small room, mingling with the scent of sickness. It was the smell of the deep earth, of things that grew in secret, shaded places. She let the tea steep until it was a dark, rich brown, then strained it into a cup. She cooled it with a little water from the bucket and carried it to her mother's bedside. "Mama," she whispered, gently lifting her mother's head. "Drink this. It will help." Martha's eyes were clouded with fever, but she seemed to understand. She drank, her throat working weakly. Ilara then made a poultice from the waxy leaves, mashing them into a paste and spreading it on a clean cloth, which she laid gently on her mother's chest. Then there was nothing to do but wait. She sat by the bed for hours as the sun crawled across the sky, marking the passage of time in the slow creep of shadows across the floor. She watched every shallow breath her mother took, praying to a God she wasn't sure was listening anymore. By evening, as the brutal heat of the day finally began to ease, she noticed a change. Martha's skin, which had been burning with fever, felt cooler to the touch. Her breathing, which had been a ragged, painful struggle, had eased into a slower, deeper rhythm. It was not a cure. Ilara knew, with a painful clarity, that there was no cure, but it was a respite. It was a small, precious, unexpected glimmer of light in the suffocating darkness of the illness. It was a gift of time, of comfort, and it was a gift that had come from him. This single act, this desperate leap of faith, had solidified a powerful, unspoken trust between them, a bond forged in shared sorrow and sealed with the hope contained in a handful of wild herbs. As if in response to the monumental shift in her inner world, the landscape itself began to change. Dark, bruised-looking clouds gathered on the western horizon, building into towering thunderheads. The air grew still and heavy, charged with a strange, electric tension. The relentless sun was swallowed by the approaching gloom. A wind picked up, cool at first, carrying the clean, thirsty smell of rain on dry earth. The storm rolled in with the shocking speed of the plains. One moment, the world was bathed in an eerie, yellow light. The next, the sky opened up. Rain fell not in drops, but in blinding, wind-driven sheets that hammered against the sod roof of the cabin. The parched ground, unable to absorb the sudden deluge, turned instantly to slick, red mud. The dry creek bed she had crossed only that morning began to swell, the water rising with terrifying speed until it was a raging, muddy torrent, tearing at its banks and carrying bushes and debris downstream. Ilara worked frantically, her body fueled by a new surge of adrenaline. She herded her 4 chickens into their small, rickety coop, barring the door against the wind. She saw water beginning to pool against the north wall of the cabin. The wall dug into the hillside, threatening to seep through the packed earth. She grabbed her father's old shovel and began to dig a desperate trench, but the mud was heavy and the rain was relentless, filling the channel as quickly as she could dig it. She saw a heavy log, part of her dwindling woodpile, and knew she had to move it, to place it as a barrier to divert the flow of water. She strained, her muscles screaming in protest, trying to drag it through the thick mud. It was too heavy. The water was rising, already lapping at the cabin's foundation. A sob of helpless frustration tore from her throat. And then, through the gray, wavering curtain of the rain, a figure emerged. He moved without a sound, a phantom appearing from the deluge. It was him, Ta-Awo. He did not hesitate. He did not speak. He walked directly to her, and without a word, took the end of the log from her grasp. His strength was a quiet, solid thing. Together, they heaved, and the log moved, sliding into place with a muddy squelch. For the next hour, they worked as one. their actions synchronized by a shared, urgent purpose. The storm raged around them, erasing the distance and the silence that had defined their every interaction. He drew his long knife and, with swift, efficient movements, cut deep channels in the mud, leading the dangerous flow of water away from the cabin's foundation. She, understanding his purpose without a word being spoken, ran to the lean-to shed and brought back a length of rope. He took it and used it to secure a section of the sod roof that the wind was trying to tear away. They were soaked to the bone, their clothes and skin covered in a thick layer of red mud. But they were united in a desperate, primal battle against the elements. When the worst of the storm had passed, leaving a steady, drumming rain in its wake, they finally stopped, exhausted and breathless. They took shelter under the small overhang of the shed. They stood side by side, their shoulders nearly touching, the heat radiating from their bodies a stark contrast to the cold, damp air. The world was filled with the sound of dripping water and the steady rhythm of the rain on the roof. It was in this small, sheltered space that he finally spoke. His voice, when it came, was low and deeper than she had imagined. His English slow and deliberate, the words carefully chosen. He pointed a muddy finger to his own chest. Tawo! The single word was a revelation. He had a name. He was not just the Watcher. He was Tawo. She found her own voice, and it came out as a hoarse whisper. Ilara. The simple exchange of names felt like a monumental event, a formal treaty signed between two warring nations. It changed everything. His dark eyes, serious and gentle, met hers. He glanced toward the cabin. She is sick? He asked. Ilara could only nod, a lump forming in her throat, her eyes suddenly burning with unshed tears. He seemed to understand. He gestured vaguely toward the creek. The roots, the leaves, they eased the pain in her chest. It was a confirmation of what she already knew, but hearing him say it, hearing the quiet concern in his voice, was a moment of profound emotional intimacy. It was a connection born from shared vulnerability, from a battle fought together against the indifferent violence of nature. As the rain continued its soft drumming on the roof, Tawo shared a fragment of his own tragedy. He gazed out from their shelter, his eyes looking past the rain-swept landscape to a place only he could see. He gestured vaguely to the east, toward the lands where the settlements were thickest. Soldiers, he said, and the single word was freighted with a universe of pain. He paused, his jaw tight. My family, gone. He did not elaborate. He did not need to, in those two simple, broken phrases. Ilara understood. The abstract Comanche problem that Silas Croft had boasted about with such hateful glee now had a face. It was the face of the grieving man standing beside her, a man whose sorrow was etched into the lines around his eyes. She saw in that moment that his isolation, his solitary existence, was not one of choice. It was the result of a devastating, violent loss, a sorrow so immense it made her own feel small. He was not just a watcher. He was a survivor. A new and powerful tension began to build in the small space between them. He bent to pick up the shovel she had been using, and as he straightened to hand it back to her, his fingers brushed against hers. A jolt, sharp and clean as lightning, shot up her arm. It was a simple, accidental touch, but it held the force of a raw, unspoken truth. They both froze, their eyes locking, and in that shared gaze, a deep and undeniable desire was acknowledged for the first time. It was terrifying. It was exhilarating. It was a fragile green shoot of life, impossible and yet insistent, pushing its way up through the desolate landscape of their lives. Later, after the rain had softened to a fine mist and Tawo had disappeared back into the wet, clean-smelling world as silently as he had arrived, Ilara was inside, tending to her mother. The air in the cabin was cool and fresh. Martha was awake, and the fever haze had lifted from her eyes. Her mind was clear, her gaze frail but startlingly perceptive. She had seen them from the window. She looked at her daughter, at her damp hair and mud-stained dress, and a flicker of something knowing and sad passed through her eyes. "He is a good man," Martha whispered, her voice a mere thread of sound, but clear as a bell in the quiet room. Ilara was stunned into silence, her heart leaping in her chest. "The way he looks at you," Martha continued, a faint, sad smile touching her lips. "Your father, he looked at me that way. It was an absolution. It was a blessing, given from the very edge of the grave. Her mother, stripped of the world's prejudices by the clarity of her own mortality, saw only the simple, unvarnished truth of the human connection she had witnessed. She saw a good man, and she saw the way he looked at her daughter. That single whispered sentence freed Ilara from any lingering guilt, any last vestige of doubt. Her feelings for Ta'awa were not wrong, not a shameful secret to be hidden away. They were real, and they were seen. The storm had washed the world clean. The air was crisp, the dust was settled, and the sky seemed a deeper, more brilliant shade of blue. It had also washed away the last of the barriers between Ilara and Tawo, the invisible line of the creek, which had separated their worlds for so long, had been erased. They no longer met as distant, wary observers, but as two people bound together by a shared struggle, sharing a fragile world. Their meetings, once governed by the rigid necessity of fetching water, became intentional. He would be waiting for her in the shade of the cottonwoods, not as a hidden watcher, but as a man waiting for the person who had come to mean more than solitude. Her fear, which had been her constant companion for weeks, dissolved completely, leaving in its place a quiet, blossoming trust. They began to talk. At first, their conversations were simple, hampered by his halting English and her shyness. But as the days grew warmer and the land recovered from the deluge, their words flowed more easily. He spoke of the seasons, of the way the sun's path across the sky dictated the movements of the deer. She told him of her mother, of the long, slow decline and the small moments of clarity that were both a blessing and a curse. His English improved with every passing day. The words and rhythms of the language, once foreign and difficult, coming more naturally as he spoke them to her. He began to teach her about the land, revealing a world she had lived on her entire life but had never truly seen. He peeled back a layer of reality, showing her the intricate, hidden life that thrived beneath the harsh, sun-bleached surface. He showed her how to dig for the starchy, nutrient-rich roots of the prairie turnip and how the broad, flat pads of the prickly pear could be stripped of their spines and roasted over a fire. He taught her to find water away from the creek, to look for the deep green of cottonwoods in a dry wash, a sure sign of moisture deep beneath the sand. He would kneel in the dust and, with a stick, draw the tracks of the animals, showing her the subtle difference between the heart-shaped hoofprint of a deer and the cloven track of a javelina, the four-toed print of a coyote and the soft pad of a bobcat. His knowledge was a form of intimacy, a sharing of the very essence of his identity. He was giving her the language of the earth, the language of survival that had been passed down through his people for generations. He was giving her the keys to his world. In return, Ilara shared the only part of her world she had left that was not defined by hardship and grief. Inside the cabin, tucked away in a small wooden box, was her only book that was not the Bible, a thin volume of Shakespeare's sonnets, its cover soft and worn, its pages filled with the elegant, looping script of her father's signature. One afternoon, in the dappled shade of the cottonwood grove by the creek, she brought the book out. His curiosity was immediate. He touched the brittle pages with a gentle finger, his expression one of reverence for an object he did not understand. "My father's," she explained. "He loved the words." Her voice, soft in the quiet of the grove, began to read. "Let me not to the marriage of true minds admit impediments. Love is not love which alters when it alteration finds, or bends with the remover to remove." Tawo did not understand all the words, the strange and formal poetry of another time, another world, but he did not need to. He watched her face, listened to the gentle cadence of her voice, and he understood the emotion woven through the verses. He understood the steadfastness of a love that was an ever-fixed mark, that looks on tempests and is never shaken. He saw it in her eyes. He felt it in the quiet space between them. It was a meeting of two vastly different worlds, bridged by a deepening affection that needed no translation. Their love, which had been a fragile, unspoken thing, began to blossom in these shared moments. The intense desire that had been sparked by a single touch in the rain now charged the air between them whenever they were close. It was a constant, humming tension, a silent acknowledgement of a truth that was becoming too powerful to ignore. One day, he was teaching her how to fletch an arrow. He had brought turkey feathers, a piece of flint for shaping, and sinew for binding. They sat on a flat rock, the tools of the craft laid out between them. He showed her how to split the feather, how to trim it to the perfect shape, how to set it into a shallow groove at the end of the arrow shaft. "It must be straight," he said, his voice a low murmur, "so it flies true." He reached for her hands, his own covering them to guide her movements. His touch was gentle but firm, his calloused fingers a warm, solid presence against her skin. He showed her how to hold the flint, how to wrap the sinew, his body leaning close, his breath warm against her cheek. The simple act of instruction became something else entirely, a moment filled with a powerful, sensual tension that made it hard for her to breathe. The world seemed to narrow to the point of contact between their hands, to the heat of his skin, to the intense focus in his dark eyes. He stopped, his hands still covering hers. The lesson was forgotten. He looked at her, and she saw a raw vulnerability in his eyes, a deep and undisguised longing that mirrored the ache in her own heart. The time for silence and stolen glances was over. Their first kiss happened by the creek at dusk. As the sun bled across the horizon, the setting sun was a daily miracle, transforming the harsh, unforgiving landscape into something achingly beautiful. It painted the sky in brilliant, fiery strokes of orange, purple, and gold, and softened the hard edges of the world. He reached out and gently touched her face, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. The moment was not tentative or hesitant. It was filled with a desperate, pent-up longing, the culmination of weeks of unspoken feelings. When his lips met hers, it was a kiss of profound relief, a deep, soul-shaking confirmation that they were not alone in their feelings. It was a homecoming, but it was also a transgressive act, a quiet and momentous rebellion against the entire world. In that single, breathtaking moment, they defied every rule, every prejudice, every hateful word that would have kept them apart. And because it was forbidden, it was all the more powerful, all the more essential. In that embrace, under the vast and painted sky, they created a sanctuary for themselves, a world of two where the cruel judgments of others could not reach them. Their secret love affair became a period of quiet, stolen joy, a hidden spring in the middle of a desert. They were building a life together in the stolen moments they could find between her duties to her mother and his solitary existence in the wilderness. He carved a small, intricate figure of a hawk for her from a piece of weathered cottonwood root, its wings outstretched, its eyes sharp and knowing. He spent days on it, his long knife moving with painstaking precision, and when he gave it to her, it felt like he was giving her a piece of his own wild spirit. She, in turn, noticed a long tear in the shoulder of his buckskin shirt. One afternoon, while he was away, she took it from where he had left it, and with her mother's needle and thread, she carefully mended it, her stitches small and neat. It was a simple act of domesticity, of care, but it was the bedrock of their growing bond. But the sanctuary they had built was fragile, and the outside world could not be kept at bay forever. Silas Croft returned. He arrived unannounced, his horse's hooves a jarring, angry sound that shattered the afternoon's peace. Ilara's heart seized with dread. She met him at the door, Ta'awo having vanished into the brush at the first sound of the rider's approach. Silas's demeanor was no longer falsely friendly. His eyes were hard, his lips a thin, tight line. He dismounted and strode toward her, his presence radiating a possessive, aggressive energy. "I have been hearing things. Ilara," he said, his voice low and menacing. "A trapper I know. He passed through this way. Saw signs of an Indian camping out near this property." He questioned her. His eyes narrowed with suspicion, boring into her as if he could peel back her skin and see the truth she was so desperate to hide. "You been seeing anyone out here? Anyone who does not belong?" "I have seen no one," she lied, her voice steady despite the frantic pounding of her heart. He did not believe her. "Your mother is not getting any better," he stated, not as a question, but as a fact. "You are going to be alone out here soon. You need my protection. It is time you stopped being foolish and agreed to marry me. I will not have my future wife living out here in the dirt, consorting with savages." It was not a proposal. It was a declaration of ownership. His entitlement was a suffocating blanket. His gaze swept the interior of the cabin and fell upon the small carved hawk sitting on the rough-hewn mantel. He stepped past her, into the cabin, and picked it up. "Where did you get this trinket?" he demanded, turning it over in his thick fingers with contempt. A fierce, protective instinct flared in Ilara. She snatched it from his hand. "It was my father's," she lied again, her voice sharp. A cruel sneer twisted his lips. "Your father was a farmer, not a heathen idol worshiper. Do not lie to me, girl." He leaned in close, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "I am warning you. If I find out you are hiding one of them, if I find one of them on this land, my men and I will handle it. We know how to deal with their kind." His threats were laced with a violent promise that made her blood run cold. His visit left a poisonous residue in the air, a stark and terrifying reminder of the danger that surrounded their fragile happiness. The central, defining tragedy of her life arrived not with a storm or a shout, but in silence. A few weeks after Silas's visit, one morning just before dawn, Ilara awoke with a start. Something was wrong. The cabin was unnervingly quiet. She listened, her body tense, and then she realized what it was. The sound of her mother's labored breathing, the constant, ragged soundtrack to her existence, was gone. A cold dread washed over her. She scrambled from her cot and rushed to the bedside. In the pale, pre-dawn light, she saw that her mother's face was peaceful, the lines of pain and struggle smoothed away. She reached out and touched her mother's cheek. It was cold. Martha Hayes had passed away in her sleep. The moment was both devastating and strangely, blessedly peaceful. The long suffering was over. For a long moment, Ilara could not move, could not think. Then a tidal wave of grief, so immense it threatened to drown her, crashed down. Her entire life, every thought, every action, had been defined by her mother's illness, dedicated to her care. Now, that purpose was gone. She was utterly, terrifyingly adrift in the vast, silent ocean of her life. She stumbled out of the cabin in a daze, the rising sun blinding her. She walked numbly, her feet carrying her down the familiar path toward the creek. The world seemed surreal and distant, as if she were watching it through a pane of wavy glass. Tawo found her there, crumpled on the ground by the water's edge. She was not weeping loudly. She was shaking, her body racked with a deep, silent anguish that was more terrible than any scream. He came to her side, his movements silent, his face etched with a sad understanding. He knew immediately what had happened. He did not offer empty words of comfort. He simply sat beside her on the ground, his presence a solid, grounding force against the chaos of her grief. He sat with her for a long time as the sun climbed higher in the sky. When she finally looked at him, her eyes hollow and lost, he reached out and pulled her into his arms. He held her tightly as she finally let go, her sobs tearing through the silence, her tears soaking the front of his buckskin shirt. He held her through the storm of her grief, absorbing her pain. His own past losses allowing him to understand her sorrow in a way that no one else in the world could. He knew the shape of this emptiness. He had lived with it himself. Together, they performed the last sacred act. He did not ask. He simply picked up her father's shovel from the shed and walked toward the small hill behind the cabin where a single, weathered wooden cross marked her father's grave. The shared physical labor of digging into the hard, rocky Texas soil was a ritual of mourning. They took turns, their movements rhythmic, the scrape of the shovel against stone the only sound. When it was done, they went back to the cabin. They gently wrapped Martha's frail body in her best quilt, the one with the faded star pattern she had pieced together so many years ago. They carried her to the hill and laid her to rest in the cool earth. As they stood over the fresh grave, the sun setting behind them, the sky once again a blaze of color, they were no longer just lovers. The lines that had once separated them, the creek, their cultures, their histories, had been completely erased. They were family, bound together by a love born in isolation, a life forged in hardship, and now, the profound and unbreakable intimacy of death. In the wake of her mother's death, a heavy and oppressive quiet settled over the homestead. The silence was no longer a peaceful emptiness, but a profound and echoing void. The small cabin, which had been the entire world for so long, now felt cavernous and cold. For Ilara, grief was not an emotion but a physical presence, a crushing weight on her chest that made every breath an effort, every simple task a monumental labor. To lift a bucket, to stoke the fire, to simply exist from one moment to the next required a will she was not sure she possessed. Tawo did not leave her side. He seemed to understand that words were useless against such a monolithic sorrow. Instead, he spoke in a language of action, a quiet and constant testament of his care. He moved into the small, lean-to shed, giving her the illusion of solitude while never being more than a few steps away. Each morning, she would find a brace of rabbits or a quail left on the cabin step. The woodpile, which had been dwindling, was always full. The scent of freshly split mesquite sharp in the air. He was a silent, watchful presence, a grounding force that kept her from completely succumbing to the listless despair that threatened to pull her under. Their relationship deepened in the shared quiet of mourning. They were a unit now, their lives fully and irrevocably intertwined. The last vestiges of their separate worlds had fallen away. She was completely reliant on his strength and his knowledge of the wild, and he had fully accepted the role of her protector, her partner. In the evenings, they would sit together on the porch, not speaking, simply watching the stars emerge in the vast, dark sky. Two solitary souls finding solace in the silent company of the other. But news, like water, always finds a way to travel, even in the driest of lands. A circuit preacher, passing through on his way to a distant settlement, had stopped at the homestead to offer his condolences and had carried the news of Martha Hayes's passing with him to the town of Redemption. For most, it was a piece of sad, unremarkable gossip. For Silas Croft, it was an opportunity. He sat in the grimy, smoke-filled saloon in Redemption, a half-empty bottle of whiskey at his elbow, and the news struck him with the force of a revelation. The old woman was gone. The girl was alone, unmoored, vulnerable. And now, in his mind, his for the taking, the persistent rumors, brought to him by a trapper who had seen signs of a lone Indian living wild near the Hayes property, now clicked into place. He imagined Ilara, alone and grieving, falling under the sway of some savage, and a possessive, violent rage ignited within him. He saw it as his duty, his right, to claim her. He would be her savior, whether she wanted him to be or not. He gathered two of his cronies from the saloon's darker corners, a lanky, gap-toothed ranch hand named Jeb and a heavy-set, slow-witted man named Cole. They were men as brutish and as steeped in prejudice as he was, men who saw violence as a form of sport. Silas bought them a round of whiskey, his voice a low, conspiratorial rumble. "The Hayes girl. Her mother finally passed. She is all alone out there." He let that sink in. "Been hearing stories there is a Comanche buck sniffing around her place. We cannot have that." He painted a picture for them, a righteous mission cloaked in the language of chivalry. "We are going to ride out there," he said, pouring another round. "Pay our respects to the dead, and we are going to make sure that girl is safe. We will run that redskin off for good and convince her to come back to town where she belongs. With me." He smiled, a predator's grin. "There might even be some sport in it." Jeb and Cole, their minds clouded with cheap whiskey and the promise of a fight, readily agreed. Their stated goal was a mission of mercy. Their true intention was to hunt. The confrontation happened on a hot, still afternoon a few days later. The air was thick and stagnant, shimmering in the heat. Not a leaf stirred on the cottonwoods. The entire landscape seemed to be holding its breath, waiting. Ilara and Taoawa were inside the cabin. The door open to catch any stray breeze. She was mending a seam in her dress. The simple, repetitive motion of the needle a small comfort, while he was carefully sharpening the flint head of an arrow. The sound reached them both at the same time, the rhythmic beat of approaching horses, at least 3 of them, moving at a steady, deliberate pace. Tawo was on his feet in an instant, his body a study in coiled tension. He moved silently to the window, peering out from the edge of the frame. His expression, when he turned back to her, was grim. "Riders," he said, his voice low and flat. Ilara's needle froze in the cloth. A surge of cold dread, sharp and sickening, washed over her. She went to the door and looked out. Her heart plummeted. In the lead was Silas Croft, and behind him rode the 2 men she had seen him with in town. She knew, with an instinct as certain as the rising of the sun, that this was not a social call. This was the trouble she had been dreading, the trouble he had promised to bring. "Get inside! Bar the door!" Tawo commanded, his voice leaving no room for argument. She did as he said, her hands trembling as she dropped the heavy wooden bar into its brackets. Tawo took up his bow and a quiver of arrows, his movements fluid and deadly serious. He was no longer the gentle teacher, the quiet companion. He was a warrior, his face a mask of cold resolve. Ilara, watching him, felt her own fear solidify into a hard, defiant knot in her stomach. She would not be a passive victim in her own home. Shaking but resolute, she reached above the cold fireplace and took down her father's heavy, double-barreled shotgun. Her hands were surprisingly steady as she broke it open, checking the load. This was her home. Her parents were buried on the hill behind it. She would defend it. Outside, Silas and his men reined in their horses, dismounting in a cloud of dust. Their demeanor was arrogant, their movements aggressive. They hitched their horses and strode toward the cabin. "Ilara," Silas bellowed, his voice falsely cheerful. "We heard about your mother. So sorry for your loss. Come on out. No need for you to be alone at a time like this." His voice was slick with a sympathy that could not mask the threatening undertone. The cabin remained silent. The only sound was the buzzing of flies in the oppressive heat. Silas's patience, never a deep well, snapped. The pretense of civility vanished, stripped away to reveal the raw ugliness beneath. "We know you have got a redskin hiding in there with you, you filthy squaw lover," he roared, his voice thick with hatred. "Send him out, or we are coming in to drag him out ourselves." The words were a brutal assault, a violation that felt worse than a physical blow. At that moment, the heavy bar on the inside of the cabin was lifted. The door swung open. But it was Tawo who stepped out, not Ilara. He moved onto the small porch and stood there, bow in hand. An arrow knocked on the string. He was a silent, defiant challenge. His body poised, his eyes narrowed and fixed on Silas. And then Ilara appeared, stepping into the doorway behind him. The long, dark barrels of the shotgun held steady in her hands, resting on her hip. The sight of them together, the Comanche warrior and the farmer's daughter, a united front on the porch of the small sod cabin, was more than Silas Croft could stomach. It was the living confirmation of his ugliest suspicions, the ultimate defilement of his possessive fantasy. It was a sight that ignited his violent hatred into a raging inferno. The standoff was brief and brutal. The world seemed to shrink to the dusty space between the porch and the three men. Jeb, emboldened by whiskey and his employer's rage, raised his rifle. The fight exploded. It was not a noble duel from a storybook, but a messy, ugly, chaotic scramble for survival. Before Jeb could even aim, Tawo's bowstring twanged. The arrow flew, a flicker of deadly grace, and sank deep into the fleshy part of Jeb's shoulder. He screamed, a high, thin sound of shock and pain, and dropped his rifle in the dust. Silas, letting out a roar of pure fury, charged the porch, his intention to use his superior size and weight to tackle Tawo and crush him. Elara saw the immediate danger to the man she loved. Her fear and rage coalesced into a single, decisive action. She aimed not at Silas but to his side and pulled the trigger. The blast of the shotgun was deafening, a physical blow to the air that echoed off the silent landscape. The kickback slammed her hard against the doorframe, her shoulders screaming in protest. The buckshot went wide of Silas but tore into the leg of the second crony, Cole, who had been raising his own pistol. He collapsed to the ground, howling and clutching his shredded thigh. The fight became a close-quarters, desperate struggle. Silas hit the porch, his momentum carrying him into Tawo. They grappled, a desperate tangle of muscle and will. Silas was bigger, heavier, his strength born of brute force. But Tawo was faster, his movements honed by a life of survival, and he fought with a cold, deadly efficiency. They crashed against the rough-hewn posts of the porch, their grunts and the thud of their bodies the only sounds besides Cole's pathetic whimpering. Tawo, pinned against the cabin wall, managed to free a hand and draw the long knife from the sheath at his belt. The blade flashed in the harsh afternoon sun. Silas, seeing the knife, was driven into an even greater frenzy. In his blind rage, he lunged, foregoing any attempt at defense, his only thought to overwhelm and destroy. In the ensuing struggle, a terrible, final moment occurred. Tawo, using Silas's momentum against him, deflected the man's charging arm. Thrown off balance, clumsy in his fury, Silas stumbled forward. His own forward momentum, the force of his own hatred, impaled him on the steady, waiting blade of Tawo's knife. The blade slid deep into his chest, just below the ribs. There was a moment of shocked, absolute silence, broken only by the horrible, gurgling sound Silas made as his eyes went wide with disbelief. He looked down at the knife hilt protruding from his body, then up at Tawo. He collapsed onto the porch, a heavy, lifeless sack. The two injured men, seeing their leader fall, were paralyzed for a second by sheer terror. Then they scrambled to get away. Jeb, clutching his bleeding shoulder, managed to get to his horse and haul himself into the saddle. Cole dragged his shattered leg through the dust, whimpering, and somehow pulled himself onto his own mount. They fled in a blind panic, galloping away as if the devil himself were on their heels. Back toward the town of Redemption, Elara and Tawo were left in the sudden, ringing silence. They stood on the porch, their chests heaving, standing over the body of Silas Croft. The dust began to settle. The thick, metallic smell of gunpowder and fresh blood hung heavy in the hot, still air. They had survived. They had defended their home. In a brutal, primitive way. They had served a form of justice on a man who would have destroyed them without a second thought. But the victory was terrifying. Adrenaline faded, leaving a cold, hollow dread in its place. They had killed a white man, a rancher, a man with connections and cronies in town. They both knew, with an absolute and sickening certainty, what would happen next. The story Jeb and Cole would tell in Redemption would not be one of self-defense. It would be a story of a savage Indian and a fallen woman murdering a respectable citizen. A posse would come, or maybe just a lynch mob. It did not matter. They would not come for justice. They would come for vengeance. Their home, the small piece of land that Alara's father had bled for and her mother had died for, the only home she had ever known, had just become the most dangerous place on earth. The immediate aftermath of the violence was a surreal, numbing calm. The deafening roar of the shotgun had been replaced by a profound and ringing silence, broken only by the buzzing of flies that had already begun to gather. The body of Silas Croft lay twisted in the dust of the yard, a grotesque and final testament to the brutal confrontation. The sharp, metallic scent of gunpowder and blood hung heavy in the hot, still air, a sickening perfume that clung to the back of the throat. The adrenaline that had flooded Alara's body, turning her fear into fierce resolve, drained away, leaving her weak and trembling. Her shoulder throbbed where the shotgun stock had slammed into it. Tawo stood beside her, his chest still heaving from the struggle, his face a grim mask of stone. His knuckles were bruised, and a dark stain was spreading across his buckskin leggings where he had wiped his blade. And then, as they stood there, two survivors in a tableau of violence, the full and terrible reality of what they had done crashed down upon them. There would be no trial. There would be no understanding. The story that Jeb and Cole would tell in the saloons of Redemption would be a simple, ugly tale stripped of all context and truth. It would be the story of a bloodthirsty savage and a fallen woman murdering a respectable rancher who had only been trying to help. A marshal's posse or a lynch mob, the name did not matter. The outcome would be the same. They would come with rifles and ropes, their hearts filled with righteous vengeance. The decision was made without a single word being spoken. Their eyes met over the body of the man who had forced their hand, and in that shared gaze was a moment of absolute, terrible clarity. They could not stay. The home that Alara had fought to maintain, the small patch of earth that held the sum of her life and the bones of her parents, had become a trap. This realization was a fresh and agonizing tragedy, a profound loss layered upon all the others. She had lost her mother to sickness, and now she would lose her home to violence. She would lose her history, her memories, the very ground that defined who she was. She was being unmade, scoured from the landscape as surely as if she had never existed. There was no time for grief. Survival was a harsh and demanding master. They worked with a grim, urgent efficiency, the setting sun a ticking clock that measured the short time they had left. Tawo, his face still set and unreadable, went to their only horse. With swift, practiced movements, he saddled the animal. Then, using his knife, he cut two long, sturdy poles from the cottonwood grove and, with lengths of rope and a piece of hide, fashioned a travois, a simple, crude sledge that could be dragged behind the horse. While he worked, Alara moved through the cabin like a ghost, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. She was a stranger in her own home, her every glance a painful farewell. "What do you take when you must leave everything?" She touched the back of her mother's rocking chair, its wood worn smooth by years of use. She ran a hand over the rough-hewn table her father had built, the knife marks from 100 family meals etched into its surface. Each object was a memory, and each memory was a small death. She selected only the most essential and meaningful items. From the pantry, she took a small sack of flour and a pouch of dried jerky. Not enough, but all they had. She took the tinderbox, flint, and steel, for without fire, there was no life. She took her father's heavy hunting knife, its blade still sharp, and from her mother's bedside table, she took the old, dented tin locket that held two tiny, faded portraits of her parents, their faces young and hopeful, from a life before hardship had worn them down. Finally, she took the worn copy of Shakespeare's sonnets. The small book felt impossibly fragile. a delicate and useless thing in a world that demanded only strength. But it was a link to her father's gentler side, and a bridge to the man who now stood outside, waiting for her. She wrapped the locket and the book in a spare piece of linen and placed them carefully in a leather satchel. She would carry these herself. Everything else would be left behind. A silent testament to a life abandoned. The most difficult moment was the last, as the sun finally sank below the horizon, casting long, mournful shadows across the land. They walked to the small hill behind the cabin. 2 mounds of earth, one old and settled, one new and raw, marked the final resting places of her family. The air was cool now, and a gentle breeze whispered through the dry grass. Alara knelt and placed a wild prairie rose, its petals a fragile splash of pink in the twilight, on her mother's grave. Tears she thought she no longer had streamed silently down her face, falling onto the dark, thirsty soil. "I am sorry, Mama," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I have to go, but I will not forget you. I will not forget either of you." Tawo stood beside her, a silent pillar of support in the gathering gloom. He placed a hand on her back, his touch solid and reassuring. He understood this farewell. He knew the pain of leaving your dead behind. This simple, heartbreaking act closed the final chapter of her old life. The girl who had fetched water and cared for her mother was gone, buried here on this hill with her parents. A new woman, a fugitive, would walk away into the darkness. Under the cover of a moonless, star-dusted night, they abandoned the homestead. Tawo led the horse, which pulled the travois loaded with their meager supplies. Alara walked beside him, her father's shotgun in her hands, her back turned on the only home she had ever known. They headed west, away from redemption, away from the laws of white men, into the vast, unknown, and dangerous territory of the Comanche. Their journey was an arduous and unforgiving ordeal. The land they traveled through was a harsh and beautiful enemy. By day, they would hide, finding shelter in narrow arroyos or thickets of mesquite, sleeping in short, fitful bursts, ever fearful of the glint of the sun on a rifle barrel or the telltale dust cloud of riders on the horizon. By night, they would travel, moving through a surreal landscape of silver and shadow under the cold, indifferent light of the stars. Tawo's skills were the only thing that kept them alive. He was a creature of this wilderness, and he moved through it with a quiet confidence that amazed her. He could find water where there seemed to be none, digging into the damp sand of a dry riverbed, or showing her a hollow in a rock that had collected the last of a recent rain. He hunted silently with his bow, his arrows flying true to bring down a rabbit or a prairie chicken, their only sustenance. He navigated by the constellations. The great map of the night sky is familiar to him as the lines on his own hand. For Alara, alone, this landscape would have been a death sentence. With him, it was a harsh but passable road to an unknown future. Their shared hardship forged the final, unbreakable seal on their bond. They were stripped of everything: home, safety, society, their very names, except each other. Their love was no longer a secret, stolen thing, a fragile blossom hidden from the world. It was their central reality, the engine of their survival. The one solid thing in a world of uncertainty. In the profound quiet of their hidden camps, huddled together for warmth against the chill of the desert night, they would talk. They spoke of the future, a concept that had once seemed an impossible luxury. They dared to dream of a place of peace, a hidden valley somewhere in the vast emptiness where they could be safe, where the world could not find them. It was a fragile, desperate glimmer of hope, and it was all that sustained them on their desperate flight. They traveled for weeks. The soles of Alara's boots wore thin, and her body ached with a weariness that went bone deep. Their hope, once a steady flame, began to fray and flicker. And then, one afternoon, when she felt she could not take another step, Tawo stopped. He pointed to a high, red rock cliff face that seemed to be a solid, impassable wall. "There," he said. He led her and the horse toward it, and she saw what she had missed. A narrow, hidden canyon pass, its entrance almost completely obscured by a fall of rock and a thick growth of juniper. It was barely wide enough for the horse to squeeze through. He led them into the cool, shadowed crevice. They walked for what felt like a mile, the high rock walls pressing in on either side, the sky a thin ribbon of blue far above. And then the pass opened up. They stepped out of the shadows and into the sunlight, and Alara gasped. Before them lay a small, secluded valley, a pocket of impossible green nestled within the harsh, red rock country. It was a place that should not have existed. A clear, sparkling stream ran through its center, its banks lined with a thick grove of tall, healthy cottonwoods. The valley floor was lush with a carpet of thick, green grass, dotted with wildflowers. It was a sanctuary, perfectly protected and hidden from the outside world. The sense of relief was so sudden, so total, so overwhelming, that Alara's knees gave way. She sank to the ground and wept, not from sorrow or fear, but from the sheer, unburdened hope of a new beginning. Tawo knelt beside her and held her, his own eyes scanning the valley with a look of profound peace. They were home. The final scene takes place a year later. They have built a new life from the rock and timber of the valley. A small, sturdy cabin, more primitive than her old home but built with their own hands, is nestled in the shelter of the canyon wall. A thin curl of smoke rises from its stone chimney. A fire burns warmly in the hearth inside. And outside, a small, thriving garden is enclosed by a simple fence, its rows of corn, squash, and beans a testament to their hard work. Alara and Tawo are sitting on a rough-hewn bench outside the cabin. Watching the sun set, the light turns the high canyon walls a brilliant, fiery gold. The scene is a deliberate, quiet echo of the evening of their first kiss, but the desperate, fearful longing is gone, replaced by a deep, hard-won peace that has settled into their very bones. Alara is visibly pregnant, her body full with the promise of a new life. Her hand rests on her swelling belly, a gesture of instinct and love. Tawo sits beside her, his arm around her shoulders, his own hand gently covering hers where it rests on her belly. It is a gesture of protection, of partnership, of a future they had dared to dream of in the darkest of nights. The world outside their hidden sanctuary is still dangerous. Their pasts are still filled with the dark shadows of tragedy and loss. But here, in this place they have made for themselves, they have found their own justice, their love, born in isolation, forged in violence, and tempered by grief, has become their ultimate act of survival and defiance. It is not a storybook ending, not a simple happily ever after. It is something more real, more powerful. It is a quiet, enduring moment of hope, of a new life about to begin in a world they have built together. Thank you for listening to our story. Please let us know in the comments where you are listening from. Subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts in English.